words and his messages. So although I'm excited to hear him this evening, I am sorry to see him leave our premises. I'm going to give them as much time as I can, but a couple of quick announcements that I want to make. First of all, introducing our friend Will Nichols. If you'll stand up, it's Will's first official day with us as our interim bridge. I know, and we know he's for real because he's got a badge. And we are thrilled to have Will with us. Following our wrap up this tonight, I guess, walking into next week, Will is going to be taking over with a series on the foundations of faith. So he's going to be speaking in this very room for the next 6 weeks, leading up to Advent. And he's going to be focusing on the foundations of our faith. And he is going to cover the essentials of Reformed theology and how they influence our worship, work, and mission together. So sounds very intriguing, and looking forward to that. I will also say that we have about one more week. We've got spots remaining on our Reformation tour, where we will be headed to Switzerland, France, and Germany in the spring of next year. We've got a great group going, but a few spots left. Trying to get those last commitments by the 7th of October, which is, I think, the first of next week. So Will is going to be our theological hero on that trip. Will Nichols is going with us, and he's going to be talking us through some of the things that we're experiencing while we are touring some pretty spectacular landscape and architecture. So thank you, Will. No further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Melton to give us as much time as we can.
I think I may move that to the podium over here too.
Okay.
Nobody's going to steal this podium from you. Thank you all for the privilege that you've given me to be with you. This has been a joy. It's been a week that I didn't plan very well because I've been teaching a 1-week intensive at Erskine. So I've taught from 9 to 4 today, and we'll do that tomorrow. But I'm excited to be with you, and I appreciate your inviting me to this. I also have a special guest tonight that I don't normally have. This is my daughter, Beth Melton. She is a teacher at McCants High School. She lives close to that. She has 2 beautiful daughters, my 2 granddaughters, 2 of my granddaughters, and she rarely ever gets to hear me. She probably won't do it again. But she's fun to have around, and she's a good teacher and loves what she's doing, so I guess she got that from me maybe as well. All right, tonight we are going to look at, we didn't do anything in session 3 last week as far as the material here, so we're going to be dealing with it. It looks like a whole lot of stuff, but it's just to give you sort of a basic understanding. And then the last thing we'll deal with today is to raise the question that I think is most important. We've spent these 4 weeks studying this intertestamental period. What value? Why should we do that? It's a period of time that the Christian faith largely has skipped over. You know, it's called the silent years. Of course, we've discovered it's anything but that. And so we're going to pose some questions, and the list that I have here is not exhaustive, but I think it does justify what you've done with your time this week and what I've done with mine. It's an interesting period for lots of different reasons. But let's look at the literature first. One of the greatest contributions, and it's one of the reasons that we'll get to in a minute, is that this period of time, roughly 400 years before the birth of Jesus, was an incredibly productive literary, a body of literature that you would not be able to work through in several lifetimes. And I'm really not exaggerating that. Jewish rabbis and Jewish scholars, they knew what it was to write. And a lot of stuff is written during that period of time. So what I've done is divided it into 5 major categories. Some of these you are familiar with, some you may not be as familiar with at all. But particularly the first 2 are the first one, and that is the Old Testament Apocrypha. So we're going to talk about what these books were. First of all, where they came from and what kind of books they are. These are books that do not appear in most of our Old Testament listings because they were not canonized by Christians. Roman Catholics have them in their Bible. They canonized them, and some of the European denominations have canonized part of them. I couldn't get a real clear picture of that in terms of what I was reading because it appeared to be a little bit muddy. And there's enough mud in my life, and I don't see that. I don't spend a whole lot of time with that. But the first group of these books are called the Apocrypha. Now, the word Apocrypha means hidden writings. That's a little bit deceptive, but hidden writings. It's a little bit deceptive because these books are not secretive. These books are not, they don't have some sort of special coded language. If you read them, you will discover they are just like the books in the Old Testament that are canonized. This is a partial list. In my research, what I discovered was that there's not a single list of the Apocrypha. So some scholars and some religious bodies will list 15, 14 or 15, some 12, some 10. And I just to give you a sample, there are others as well, but these are books. They were written during the period of time that we've been talking about, the intertestamental period. Now, all of them are worthy of reading, and if you want access to them, if you have the Oxford Annotated Bible, you can get this in two forms. You can get the Oxford Annotated Bible by itself. Well, that's going to be your Old Testament and the New Testament, and in the RSV, Revised Standard Version. And there will be some articles in there that tell you a lot about the background of both Old and New Testament. There's a lot of information here. There's education for people that are interested in the Bible. But there's another version of it, and that is, it is the Oxford Annotated, the New Oxford Annotated Bible with the Apocrypha. So the Apocrypha is in the back. Most of the apocryphal books are short. This, of course, they appear here in the Revised Standard Version translation. They're easy to read, but you're going to run into stuff that's crazy to you. But a good Jew of the Intertestament period would understand exactly, but there's some ambiguities. But these books, the most important would be First Maccabees, and it's in here if you want to read that. The description, what we described, the events of the intertestamental period and the Maccabean revolt and Antiochus Epiphanes, who outlawed the practice of Judaism, all that comes from First Maccabees. There's actually a Second Maccabees and a Third Maccabees and a Fourth Maccabees. They are less valuable than First Maccabees. Most Old Testament scholars would regard First Maccabees as history, that it's as historical as First Kings is in the Old Testament. It's just dealing with a different period of time. But oftentimes when I introduce these to students, I say, well, is it going to hurt me to read them? I hope not. No, it's not going to hurt you. You're not going to get cursed or blinded or anything like that at all. But don't read First Maccabees if you don't ever read Genesis through Malachi. You know, it's a practical thing. But these are not. There's no smoking guns in here. There's nothing that's going to wreck your faith or anything like that at all. These were Jewish writings. The Maccabean books are historical works. They tell us. They actually are the basis of the reconstruction that we did here the last couple of weeks, couple of sessions. Some of them are short stories. they were very fond of the Old Testament figure of Daniel. There are a whole bunch of the apocryphal and the next category of books, the pseudepigraphal books, that have Daniel in them. Some of them are even attributed to Daniel. But Daniel was the hero. And why was he a hero? Well, what does the book of Daniel tell us? He was forced to not pray to his God. He was forced. They couldn't pray to God. And so he and his friends are thrown in the fiery furnace. An edict takes place that outlaws any prayer to God. What does Daniel do? Well, he doesn't go out in the street and demonstrate. He just does what he usually does. He goes up to his roof, to the top story of his house. He opens the door like he always did. Opens the window, and he prays. And he gets into all kind of trouble. But God miraculously saves him, spares him. So Daniel was a hero of faith. Well, wasn't that exactly what was going on during the Maccabean period? Exactly the same thing. So they read these stories because they encouraged them. They gave them understanding. They gave them strength to be faithful to God. And some of them are funny. Now I'm not going to read it because it would take too much time, but it's very, very short. But I'm going to paraphrase it. This is one of my favorite ones. It's called Bel and the Dragon. Bel and the Dragon. It almost sounds like a 60s rock folk song or something. Like Puff the Magic Dragon or whatever. Bel is a common name that appears in these books because Bel represents an idol, a false god. It's really connected to what we find in the Old Testament with Baal. And there are a lot of gods and goddesses called Baal. It's not one. But the name Baal stuck because the name Baal means master. It means Lord. And so you remember the scene in the Old Testament in 1 Kings when Elijah is up on Mount Carmel and they've got the sacrifice there and the prophets of Baal are around. And they're begging Baal to come and consume the sacrifice, and they do that all day long, and he never shows up. And then Elijah has water poured on it to make sure there's no funny stuff going on, and he prays to God, and lightning comes down and consumes the sacrifice, the stone altar, the wood altar, and even laps up the water around it to show that God is the God to be worshipped, not Baal. Well, this is a variation of the same story, and again, it features Daniel. It's not clear where to fit this in, but the king who is described here is Darius, and he was a Persian king, same king who appears in the book of Daniel. This story is only 2 pages long, so you can read it in a few minutes. It is actually a parallel story that goes with it, but I'm going to tell you the story of Bel and the Dragon. Bel is the god that the Persians are worshiping, and Daniel lives there, and he continues to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and so they are constantly testing him. So the king comes to him and shows him a temple that is where sacrifices are made to Baal. And he says that the king says that Baal is the god to be worshipped because every night they put sacrifices, they put meat, they put fruit, they put sacrifices, and they lock the door of that. And every morning when they open up the temple, all the sacrifices are gone. And so the king says, Daniel, if Baal is a fraud, and I'm paraphrasing, if Baal is a fraud, then I will get rid of Baal worship and I'll worship your God. Well, Daniel says, okay, you're on. So they late afternoon comes, they put all the sacrifices in there, they're all in that temple, they put a lock on it, but before they do, Daniel takes something like some flour and he just gently puts it on the floor. Well, they lock it, and what happens that night is the priest and their families, wives, children, there's a secret entrance to it. And of course it's pitch dark. So they go, and of course they have done it, because they do it every night. They know they can do it by feel, and so they climb into it, they sneak into it when everybody's asleep, and they get all that food and they eat it. And then they sneak out that night. And the next morning, the king is at Daniel's door, and he says, let's go look at it, Daniel. And they go to it, and they take the lock off, and they open it up, and all the food has been consumed. And the king says, aha, that proves it. Baal is God. And Daniel says, look at the floor. And he sees all these footprints. That was the footprints of the priest and his family and his children and so forth. And the king says, and I'm really paraphrasing here, well, you got me again, Daniel. I guess your God is God. So he orders all the priests and his family to be executed, and they close the temple down. Yeah. It's really interesting stuff to read late at night, puts you in a good mood. But that's the kind of stories. One of them, the one that follows that, is called the Prayer of Manasseh. Now, you may remember the story of Manasseh. He was the absolute worst king of Judah, of Israel. He adopted all the Assyrian religion. He put an altar to Baal in the temple alongside the altar to God. He was the absolute, the Old Testament says that Manasseh did more evil in his 45 years of reigning than all the other kings of Israel put together. That's a little bit of an exaggeration, but that shows he was a bad guy. He even sacrificed his own children to the pagan gods. Well, 2 Chronicles 33 says, Manasseh was taken by Nebuchadnezzar when Judah fell in 587. No, I'm sorry, it was the Assyrians. It was earlier than that. They took him, and the way they did it was the Assyrians, they had these hooks on chains, and they would take the king and they would wrap the hook through his nose, and they would lead him out like an animal. They took him to Syria, and he prayed to God to forgive him. It's one of the most radical stories of forgiveness in the Old Testament. It occurs only in 2 Chronicles 33. God not only forgave him, he restored him to his kingship, let him come back. And Manasseh came back, and he undid all of the bad things that he had done. Well, all the 2 Chronicles 33, all it says is he prayed to God, and God was moved with his prayer and responded to it and showed mercy to him. This is the prayer of Manasseh. Now, whether this is the one he prayed or whether this is the one somebody thought he prayed, that's harmless. It's not going to hurt you to read the prayer of Manasseh. Just again, don't neglect reading the canonized scripture, but the apocryphal works are they're interesting to read, and if you have occasion, you can actually buy a volume of the Oxford Annotated Apocrypha by itself. It's real thin. As a matter of fact, I had one until a while back, and I lent it to a student, and the student went away. And so, but you can buy it separate if you already have. I had worn out the two Oxford Annotated that I had used through the years, and so I needed. So I got one with the Apocrypha in the back of it. There are about 12 or 15 of them that are listed there, but they are interesting works, and they are perfectly consistent with the times that we've been talking about for the last 3 weeks. All right, that's one category. Now, second category. Now, this is where the weird stuff comes. It's called the Pseudepigrapha. Apocrypha means the hidden writings. The Pseudepigrapha mean the false writings. Pseudo. And this is a huge, huge body of material. Sorry, I can't spell. Huge body of material. Nobody has canonized it. Now, if you want to read something that is strange, most of the books of the Pseudepigrapha, and I've listed most of them here, the Pseudepigrapha actually continued to be written and produced after the time of Jesus. So there are about at least another dozen that were written in the early 1st century and some even in the 2nd century. They're all pretty much the same time. The Pseudepigrapha are an example, most of them are an example of what we call apocalyptic literature. Apocalyptic literature. Apocalyptic literature flourished during this period of time. And the reason is, apocalyptic literature is concerned only about one thing: the coming kingdom of God at the end of the age. Now, why would it flourish in the time of the Maccabees, and the time we've been talking about for the last few weeks? Why would it flourish?
Because it was so bad.
They were hopeless. It was hopeless. I mean, you're a Jew living in the 2nd century BC, and your religion is outlawed. The king orders his men to take your Torah, your Old Testament, and burn it in the street. You are forbidden, if you're a Jew, to have your son circumcised on the 8th day of his life. If you are caught praying, you are jailed and would later be executed. That's pretty bad. And that's the situation they were in. Well, when God's people get in that kind of situation, their only hope is what God will finally rescue with the coming of the kingdom. So these works describe that coming kingdom. Now, if you read them, and I've read most of them, or at least read in most of them, and some of them are incredibly long. First Enoch is much longer than, it's probably longer than our New Testament, or at least a big portion of it. And it is weird. It's vision after vision after vision. God, Enoch is the prophet or the apocalyptist, and God comes to him and he transports him to heaven. And Enoch has all of these strange visions. Apocalyptic literature is symbolic, and so it makes all kinds of use of strange images, beasts, and it uses a lot of numbers, but the numbers have symbolic meaning. Everybody would have understood it in those days. We don't, but they would, because they knew that they were common. It was common to them. They have these strange kinds of beasts that have 5 heads and 20 horns and that sort of stuff. And I'm not exaggerating. If you read the pseudepigrapha, many of those, you're going to conclude, as I do, that people were smoking something. And I'm not making light of it. That's really what some of it is. Now, some of it is not that quite extreme, but much of it is. And it's ununderstandable by us. But all of these were ways of comforting Jewish people. Because the message of apocalyptic is this world is shot through with evil. But God is still in control. Wait. Be faithful. Don't be sucked in by the deceptions of the day. And you can see how that was being important during the Maccabean period to hear that. Don't be, because God is in control. He appears to be absent, but he's not. But one day, and one day soon, he's going to bring an end to this. And this is what it's going to look like. It's a strange kind of literature. The closest we have to it, there are a few places in the Old Testament, but the closest in the New Testament is the book of Revelation. And I know how difficult that is, for us to understand, but if it's any comfort to you, the book of Revelation is almost the Reader's Digest compared to some of these. I'm not being exaggerating. It is weird stuff. And then, the copies of the Apocrypha we have right now, some of them were Christianized. Christians, valued these books as well after the time of Jesus. So they go back to an Apocalypse of Enoch, and where Enoch talks about the coming Messiah, they erase that out on the manuscript and write Jesus. So they've been Christianized. Well, that makes them even more strange, because they were written before the time of Jesus. They were written long before Jesus was even born. So that category of the pseudepigrapha has never had the kind of influence on Judaism or even on Christians than the Apocrypha have. What's interesting is that neither of these, all these volumes, the Apocrypha and pseudepigrapha, there is one quote from them in the entire New Testament. There's a reference to them in the book of Jude, of all places. And there's a reference, and it's sort of a generic reference. It's something, I forget exactly what the words are, but it's one of Jude's only one chapter, but I think it's about verse 23 in that. And if you look at the footnote in your Bible, they probably say this comes from, and I forget which apocalyptic work it comes from, but it's not a significant quote whatsoever. It's almost just a piece of poetry. And so you have all this body of literature that the Jewish people, preserved. It was interesting to Christians, but none of it is ever reflected in the New Testament, and rarely is it referred to in Jewish works as well. So it didn't have a profound influence. It was, particularly the Pseudepigrapha, it was basically desperation literature. Its purpose was to give people comfort in the worst kind of situation they'd ever been in. And so they're interesting to read. You probably will become very discouraged very quickly if you open one up and read it, but that's the kind of literature that it was. All right, that's the second kind. And that's a huge body because most of these works of the Pseudepigrapha are very, very long. And they have been preserved and the text is still there. All right, that's one thing. That's the second category of literature. Third category of literature you probably have heard about because this was the most significant archaeological discovery of the 20th century, and some would say of all time, the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered totally by accident in 1947 by a shepherd boy who was trying to, one of his goats, it must have been late in the day, of course it's at the Dead Sea, which is one of the most miserable spots on the face of the earth. The mineral content of the Dead Sea is 40%. You can actually go there, don't carry a fishing rod because there's nothing there to catch, it's dead. But you can actually, they let you swim in it and you cannot sink. I had a student several years ago that didn't believe that, and after one summer after he'd taken a seminary course, he went there. He was an older guy, and he went there and he couldn't swim. And he sent me a picture back, and there was floating in the Dead Sea. If you drowned in the Dead Sea, you're really in bad shape. You got to work at it. It's sort of like catching a fish there. But if you swim in it, and you can do it, I'm told, I've never been there, I'm told that there are showers at the edge of it. And they tell you, if you can swim in it, you can, you won't sink, but you can swim in it, but when you get out, you'd better go and take a good shower because the salt and mineral is sticking to your skin like chewing gum. And you have to scrape it off. If you don't do that, you're not going to like yourself the next morning when you wake up. You're going to have serious skin issues. It's that bad. Well, the shepherd boy was trying, it was the end of the day probably, and he was hot and sort of tired and ready to get done with this. And this goat gets up on a cliff near the Dead Sea. He throws a rock at it and he hears something crack. And so he climbs up there and he discovers the rock went in a cave. And the cave hit this urn that was made out of clay. And the urn had broken in pieces, and there was a scroll that he had never seen anything like it. It was laid on the floor. That was the beginning point. These scrolls were ancient copies of the Old Testament. And of course, they're still studying them now. This was 1947, and they didn't know what they had for a long time. And then they had, the whole politics of Israel and so forth. That they had to negotiate all that. So it's been a long and drawn out story. But the Dead Sea Scrolls, they finally, they continued to work there and dig there. They discovered that there were 11 caves, not just one. And that those caves, all of them were filled with either whole scrolls or pieces of scrolls. Some of the pieces of scrolls are like, I don't know what to liken it to, but they're tiny pieces, and to touch one would be like, when we didn't have anything to do growing up at home, we'd take the newspaper after everybody had read it and take it in the backyard and set it on fire. I mean, we didn't have much of a life. But if you do that and there's no wind blowing, you can actually read the print in the ashes. but you try to touch one of those ashes and it goes away. That's the condition of some of these scrolls. And so they may unroll one, and they will rejoice if they've been able to unroll it 4 inches in a year. It's that kind of stuff. But what they found in the Dead Sea Scrolls is there are 3 kinds of books, and then there's a lot of small pieces that they don't know what they are. There are about 800 old scrolls, mostly complete scrolls. Some of them still have some damage in them or whatever. And those 3 types of literature in those 800 scrolls is that there are multiple copies of the Hebrew Old Testament. Every book in the Hebrew Old Testament, the original language of the Old Testament, every book is there except Esther, strangely enough. There's no explanation, there's no reason why the people who produced these would have had problems with Esther, so Esther may have just been lost. There are multiple copies of many of the Old Testament books. There were certain books that the people, the Essenes that were produced this, there were certain books that were favorites. So there are multiple copies of Genesis. They particularly love the Psalms, and a few of the other books. There are multiple copies of them. And they are, the importance of that is that the Hebrew text that these are written in, scholars determined that it was 1,000 years older than any Hebrew text we had in 1947. That's the greatest value. They provided a much, much older Hebrew text from which English translations are made today. So the English translations are probably much, much better of the Old Testament than other English translations. So you have the vast majority of the books are copies of the Old Testament in Hebrew. The second category are commentaries on these Old Testament books. There are a lot of those where they write, they explain, they take a book and they explain what each verse means, and they make all kind of applications. So you have those. And then the third category, which enables us to understand who these people were, they wrote works that described their everyday life. The people that
I'm sorry.
that's all right. Yeah, it's yours. That's it. Space there. What they found was, what they discovered was this body of books that these people had written. And the people who produced these were the Essenes. They were a group of Jews, we'll talk about it in a minute, but anyway, they left behind these works that describe their daily life. So we know something about them. The Essenes are actually mentioned in the works of Josephus, who was a first century historical writer. But we knew nothing about them. They just disappeared. There was nothing about them until the scrolls were discovered. And this third category of books in the scrolls, actually the Essenes describe their daily life. They were a weird bunch of people. They were Jews, but the best guess is that they left Jerusalem right after the Maccabean revolt in 164. They left Jerusalem. They didn't all leave at one time, because they had come to the conclusion that the Maccabeans, who had led the revolt, had compromised. In other words, the Maccabeans were not orthodox enough for them. The Maccabeans were not as serious about keeping both the law of Moses. And so these Essenes pulled away from them. And they probably didn't go all at one time. There were probably groups that migrated. They wanted to go to a place where they would not be influenced by the ways of the world. Well, if you want to do that, you go to the Dead Sea, because it's miserable. It's the lowest place on earth, 1,400 feet below sea level. There's no life there. And they made a community that we call Qumran. And they stayed there for almost 300 years. And they spent their lives praying. The Qumran has been excavated, and it's full of pools They participated in ritual washings all the time. And some of their deaths have actually survived. That's where they copied these Hebrew Old Testament books. And that's where they wrote. They were isolated from the world. They were not affected. That's what they wanted to do. And that's where the scrolls came from. They would be, the best analogy would be that they were like some of the early monks of the Christian church in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Christian era. There was a monastic movement. There were Christians who believed that they could live their life of dedication to God better if they would go to a monastery and live their life there. So they abandoned family, and they were not influenced by the world, and that's exactly who the Essenes were. People had tried to tie the Essenes to John the Baptist, because John the Baptist was, he was in that area. He was not as far down as the Dead Sea, but you know how he's described in the Gospels. He dressed in camel's hair and locusts and wild honey and all that sort of stuff. And some theorists never went anywhere, but they say, well, maybe John the Baptist was a part of the Essenes. And students have asked me, they've read, it was sort of a popular, probably online kind of craze. It was popular about 15, 20 years ago. And if you look at what little bit is said about the preaching of John the Baptist in the Gospels, he is totally at odds with what the Essenes advocated, because you can read their works and you can figure out. And so I tell students when they ask me that, I say, well, the only relationship that John had to the Essenes is the same one that I have to a rabbit when I walk in the woods. We're both in the woods. But there's absolutely, if you compare what John the Baptist said, he did not call upon those that heard his preaching to withdraw from the world. He called upon them to embody righteousness in their living. And so he told tax collectors in Matthew who were coming to him, he said, repent of your sins. Now go out and don't overcharge people anymore. Those tax collectors were crooks. And so the Essenes were people who withdrew from the world. And so there's no connection except that they were in the wilderness together. Okay, there's a lot of good literature on the Dead Sea Scrolls, a lot of good stuff online that I have found. The Dead Sea Scrolls are in the process of being translated, but you can find the English translation of them easily. It's been out for a long time. And so they're interesting to read, not so much, you already got an Old Testament, so you don't need that part of it, but their community works are particularly important, because that's where we get the description. They were basically a bunch of monks. And they were not heard of. They stayed on the radar for a long time, but the Roman army found them after the Jewish war ended in AD 70 and finished them off. And of course they remained hidden completely until the modern day. Okay, let's look at the fourth category. Fourth category of literature is the Septuagint, and this is probably the most important contribution of the Septuagint. Is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. It didn't come out all of a sudden. It was a long time coming out, but it first began to come out in the year 250 BC. It came out in Egypt, and it was a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. Jewish people despised it. They hate it. And still to this day, Orthodox Jews won't come near Septuagint. And here's why. Their reason this. In the Old Testament, when we read the earliest version of the Ten Commandments, they're in Hebrew. Moses wrote them down in Hebrew. That means Hebrew is the language that God speaks. It's a holy language. You've taken that holy language that God speaks and you put it in the Greek language, which comes from this Hellenistic culture that is at odds with Judaism in every respect. But it was an absolute necessity, because it appeared in 250 250 BC in Egypt. And this was less than 100 years after Alexander died. That means Greek Alexander made Greek the universal language of the empire. That attempt to spread Greek language and culture was so effective that by the year 250, there were Jews in Egypt who could not go to the synagogue on the Sabbath because they couldn't understand a word that was being said. They could not read their Torah because it was in Hebrew, and they had lost the ability to speak and understand Hebrew. That's why this translation came out. And so it was rejected by the Jews, but this is one of virtually every Old Testament quotation in the New Testament, and there are hundreds of them. But there's 69 in Matthew by itself. They all come from the Septuagint, not the Hebrew text. Now they probably didn't have a written copy like I do. They had memorized it. But the Septuagint became the Bible of the church. Because by the days of Jesus and of course in the book of Acts, when the Christians go out and spread the good news of the gospel, they were able to spread it throughout the Roman Empire because there was a common language. The Septuagint started that, made that possible. I was doing some research some years ago, and I don't remember what I was researching or what book I was using. I probably have it, but I'll probably never find it. But anyway, I ran across this map in this book, and this map marked every place in the Roman Empire where there was evidence that the Christian gospel had gotten there by the year 400. The Roman Empire looked like they had chicken pox. Even the most remote areas, the gospel was carried there not primarily by people like Paul and Peter and others. It was carried by common, ordinary people who took their whole family, and they felt God had called them to be His missionaries, and they journeyed, and most of them never came back home again because they died. They died of disease, they died of starvation, or they were killed by their enemies. I Googled one day what was the most significant contribution of the intertestamental period, and I got one answer. And that was, well, this is not it. It wasn't an RSV. It was a Septuagint. Because that enabled the gospel to spread in the Roman Empire like it did. Okay, that's the fourth category. The fifth category is that this is the period of time when rabbinic literature begins to be produced. And what I mean about rabbinic literature is, and you may have Jewish friends, and they may refer to books like the Mishnah, which was done in 220 AD, or the Talmud, which was done in 500. These are detailed explanations of the law of Moses. These are what Jesus called with the Pharisees the traditions of the elders. And what they do is they instruct the Jew not just to honor the Sabbath day and keep it holy, but these laws tell you exactly what you can do and exactly what you can't do. They tell you exactly how far you can walk from your house, and then if you walk beyond that, you've broken the Sabbath law. The traditions of the elders. There was no attempt to, they were trying to explain the law. They were trying to make the law crystal clear so that they would never disobey it. A whole body of that literature developed during the intertestamental period and continued on in the centuries after that. And so that doesn't interest us, or probably doesn't, don't care a whole lot about that. I've read a lot of it through the years, and it's, if you're a Jew, it makes sense. If you're a Christian, you wonder, you folks y'all hadn't heard the best news yet, that you don't have to do this. You just have to trust Jesus and believe. Okay. Last question, why is the knowledge of this period important? Why is it worth something that we have spent the time that we have during the month of September and the first day of October? Well, the first reason that I give is this period is a key part of Jewish history. And we may not be Jewish, but one of the great tragedies or mysteries of history of the major world religions. Only Judaism and Christianity have the same root. We come from the same body of people. We come from Abraham. And yet what happened by the end of the 1st century AD, these two religions went separate directions. And they've never been together since then. It's an irony. Because our Old Testament is theirs as well. And you could benefit quite a bit and would enjoy reading the Apocrypha. It's not going to hurt you at all. You'd be familiar with most of the imagery because of the Christian faith was born in Judaism. The whole first generation of Christians were not Jewish converts, they were Jewish Christians. They saw their Christian faith as a completion of their Judaism. And so the earliest followers of Jesus would worship in the synagogue or the temple on the Sabbath day, which is Saturday. And then they would gather together in the house church with their fellow believers on Sunday, the first day of the week. And so it's important that we at least know something of their roots and their history. That it's worth studying for that reason at all. The second reason I've already mentioned, the gospel was able to spread in nothing short of a miraculous way, based on the observation I made a while ago about the map of Rome. By the year 400, it was everywhere, even in the most remote sections. Now, ultimately, what is responsible for that is the grace and mercy and power of God. But humanly speaking, it's because there was a universal language that connected everybody, and that was Greek. The New Testament books that were originally written in Greek, and it spread everywhere. And that couldn't be said of any other religion that we know of. And they didn't have to force people to do it. It was just spread naturally because Greek had become the universal language and everybody spoke it. All right, thirdly, when we open the Gospels, we immediately confront a group of people, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And they are enemies of Jesus, primarily the Pharisees. Where did they come from? They're never mentioned in the Old Testament. The names don't appear at all. They came from the Hasidim, those Jewish people that when Alexander was trying to spread a Greek culture, they wanted to remain faithful to the law of Moses and faithful to their gods. But remember, they had another group of Jews who were in opposition, and they were the Hellenizers, and they believed that Judaism needed to conform to Greek, and that good Jews needed to be good Greeks. The Sadducees came from the Hellenizers. The Pharisees came from the Hasidim. So the reason they didn't like each other in the days of Jesus is because they didn't like each other 200 years before. Because each one thought the other was, the Sadducees thought that the Pharisees were a bunch of legalists, religious fanatics, and the Pharisees looked at the Sadducees as a bunch of compromised Jews who were more concerned about money and pleasure than about God. This is where they came from. So what we talked about, the Hasidim, the battle between the Hasidim, and they fought with each other as to who would be the king, because that king would lead the people of Israel. They would lead them in their direction. The Hasidim would be in control, and the Hellenizers would be in control. That whole seesaw battle that occurred during the intertestamental period. That was the origin of these two groups that would later be called Pharisees and Sadducees. Okay? Fourth reason it's important to study this is what we've just said. There is a huge amount of literature that has survived that came from this period of time. We just touched it and talked about the main categories. That literature, the Septuagint, became very important not only for Jews who could no longer speak Hebrew, but it became very important for the New Testament writers and even for the church, because eventually when the New Testament comes together, eventually it takes about 300 years for that to happen. The Christian Bible becomes the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Covenant and the New. Okay, one last thing. And you can understand why this is true. Given all the insecurity and the war and the persecution and all that occurred during the intertestamental period, what came from that was a more developed view of a Messiah who would rescue Israel. And we have that in the Old Testament, but there's not a really highly developed view. During the intertestamental period, because of all these wars, a lot of these apocryphal and pseudepigraphal books talk about the Messiah, and he's a military conqueror. Well, why would they think he's a military conqueror? Well, because that's what they needed. That's who they needed that to get rid of their enemies. And so when Jesus comes along in the Gospels and he begins to make veiled claims to be the Messiah, why does nobody believe it? Even his disciples. Because he didn't come to destroy Rome by leading a battle against them. He would destroy the power of evil by soaking it up in himself, which is the only way that evil can finally be killed. If I return evil for evil, I'll propagate it. But if I soak it up and suffer and die, which he did, you kill it. And so Jesus presents himself as a suffering servant. That's the Old Testament tradition he sees himself as fulfilling. And there's a military Messiah tradition in the Old Testament, but it's not highly developed at all. But in the intertestamental period, it is, so that by the time we get to the days of Jesus, most Jews who were looking for a Messiah saw him as a military conqueror, and then they see this man, Jesus, who picks up children in his hands and blesses them, who heals people who are lame or sick, who says radical things like, if your enemy hits you on one cheek, turn the other one to him. That can't be our Messiah. And so instead of believing in it, they put him to death. But can't keep him down, because the most glorious words in the New Testament is that God raised him from the dead. But that hardened sense of a military Messiah is developed in the intertestamental period. If you read any of these works that we've talked about today, you'll see it comes up over and over again. All right, I've been going all the way up to 6:30, but I'm not give you a chance for questions or go and have something to eat. But let me tell you, I thank you so much for the opportunity, and I will be in prayer for you. I know that today is the beginning of a new ministry, new leadership in the church. And as I've been told, and I'll be in prayer for you all. It's an exciting time for you all. Thank you for letting me be a part of the church.